I am here tonight to speak in praise of public education. First of all, I want to talk about kind of where we are in public education in North Carolina. I want to talk then some about how some things have slipped. God knows they have. Then I want to talk about what we ought to do. Because, folks, this is North Carolina. We are North Carolinians. We can change things in this state, and by George, I'm determined we're going to do it. So where are we? This was an interesting year. I think it was the North Carolina school administrators maybe who took the lead in helping us celebrate the 175th year of public schools. Did you all know that? You didn't know that? In 1839, the legislature passed a law called the Common School Law, meaning we would have public schools, or at least providing that we could. And that was in 39. In 1840, the first public school was established in Rockingham County, North Carolina, close to Reidsville, close to Greensboro. That was the first one. We celebrated the 175th year. We had 1,500 people down here at the Civic Center, maybe 3,000. It's a big year. But in the 1900s, half century later, we sort of got going. We didn't have many schools. I mean, you know, we had the law. Probably no money. We know how that is, don't we? But it took a while to get the public schools going. It was about 1900 before we really had many public schools start up. The first one in my county, 1.5 miles from my house, started about the 1900s. The building is still there. It's a barn now. But I have a sense of history because I know where that school is. And by the way, I know where my grandmother walked to school. I know where my mother walked to school. One-room schoolhouses. We've had a lot of them, and thank God we started with them. And some great people have come out of them. The new chancellor at UNC, at Appalachian State University. Any of you go to Appalachian State? If you didn't go, you missed a great deal. She's a wonderful woman from, I believe she told me, either Kansas or Nebraska. Let's call it Kansas. She went to a one-room schoolhouse. People cared about them. They built them. And yeah, they walked to them to start with, but they wanted their children to have good schools. But it did get going here at about the 1900s. Let me tell you, folks, this was a poor state. I'm looking at a lot of people who've been here during the good years. You probably moved here, grew up during the good years. I knew poor North Carolina. I grew up on a farm about an hour from here, down in eastern North Carolina. And we were a poor state. But then we got started with the research triangle. How did that happen? Because we had great universities. We had invested in those great universities. We hadn't started doing it much yet for public schools. And then, of course, the research triangle got going, and we had a university research park down in Charlotte. So we went along about the first half of the 20th century, 1900s, with just sort of creeping along. In fact, the governor of Mississippi, a good friend of mine, Secretary of the Navy now, told me, he said, you know, at the end of World War II, Mississippi and North Carolina were tied in per capita income. That's a surprise to you all. It's true. North Carolina got ideas about changing things. And then in 1960, we elected a governor named Terry Sanford. I went down to Sanford when he announced his candidacy, Nina. I was down here, what do we call the center now for the performing arts? Is the Duke Center. I was there when Terry Sanford, in his early days, had a great meeting of citizens and leaders from all over the state. They were called, we're talking about an organization now that can spread across the state. They call themselves the United Forces for Education. And I remember Terry Sanford getting up there with all these people. I watched them when they came that day. You know, I was student body president at NC State, or perhaps just going into the graduate school. I saw them come. I had organized college campuses for Terry. I knew the state of North Carolina, and I still know it. I saw them come in from all the places across this state because they cared about public schools, and they wanted them to be good, and they were there to help make that happen. And Terry Sanford got up there and talked about listen to this, the audacity. I love that word. The audacity to build great public schools and to help every child get a good education, including those who need a special education and who have all kinds of needs. We responded to that leadership and that call for leadership. Terry Sanford said we got to increase teacher salary. It was way down. Where was the money going to come from? We had an ultra-conservative legislature that didn't believe in spending money. Terry looked every which way to find out how to get the money to increase teacher pay significantly. And you know the only place he could find it? Putting a tax on food. And some of you may say that was a terrible thing to do. Well, let me tell you something. It was the only place to get the money. And he knew it was going to be politically tough. It would hurt him badly, and it did politically. He paid a price, but he also got a big raise in teacher pay. I remember my college roommate who was going into teaching as a math teacher. He went straight up to Norfolk, Virginia before Terry raised the teacher pay. Then he came back. So we took a big step to improve schools in this state. We did many things, including, by the way, the right thing on school desegregation, a time that we really did do it. And I will say another word about that later. But that was a time when we had a big spurt. Sometimes these things happen in spurts. Well, in the last 30 years, Terry was elected in 1960. Served 4 years. You can only serve 4 years. I was the first 2-term governor. Then I was the first 4-term governor. I'm tired. I'm not running anymore, by the way. But in the last 30 years of the 20th century, we had a couple of governors in particular that really worked on it. One of them, elected in 1972, was named Jim Holshouser, a mountain Republican. That means he was a moderate. Jim Holshouser went in, by the way, endorsed by the NCAE because of his stands on education. So he went in, and as soon as he got in the governor's office, his staff came up to him and said, "Governor Holshouser, we found there's a surplus in the treasury. Why don't you propose that we cut taxes?" Jim Holshouser and I had both just run on a platform of establishing public school kindergartens. We didn't have them in North Carolina. Jim Holshouser said, "No, we're not going to cut taxes. We're going to put in public school kindergarten." in North Carolina, and we did. We did. He later took us to 27th in America in teacher pay. That's what you can do when you have the right leadership and the people are ready to do it. In my terms, and Ann has been so kind to talk about several of them, but I will mention the fact that we put in a reading program, because I'd been hearing too many third grade teachers tell me their pupils, their students couldn't read. And I said, we've got to change it. So we put in a reading assistant in every classroom. We did some special summer training. We supplied some extra funds for teachers to have supplies. We put in an approach to measure how our children were doing in learning. We established a National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. I bet we've got some National Board certified teachers in this room. Raise your hand if you're National Board certified. Look here. I'm going to clap for y'all. We put in Smart Start. We found out that kids weren't ready to start to school. And, you know, I'll say more about that later. But it was a big step. It cost a lot of money. Then, of course, we put in the ABCs. Again, you all may not know those words or those letters. The ABCs were an approach to, first of all, establish what students needed to know, but also to begin to reward schools and teachers based on learning. And we challenged every school to have every class make a year's gain in learning. And by golly, if they did, they got bonuses, by the way. Did you know that one year, 97% of our schools made a year's gain in learning? And teachers got $100 million in bonuses that year. They did. They earned it and they got it. And we did make huge gains in test scores. It was the RAND Corporation that said North Carolina made more progress, raised student rankings, learning more than any state in America. So we've done some big things. By the way, at the end of that time, as we entered the 21st century, North Carolina was 20th in teacher pay. That's the national average, or it was then. We had raised in 4 years teacher pay by 36% in just 4 years. That's what happened. And of course, in the early 21st century, we had more at 4 in early learning. And so we have made a lot of progress at times when the people were ready and the leaders led it, with the support, by the way, of the citizens who cared and who understood what it takes. I read every day about what these recruiters are trying to do in getting industry in here, jobs. Well, you're looking at the man who recruited more industry to North Carolina than any governor in history. You know how I got them? I told them how great the schools were in this state. That's right. And I used to say to these CEOs, I say, you want to know why you can be sure the public schools are good in North Carolina? Because the doctors send their children to them. You get what I mean? They can afford those private schools, and they didn't go to them. Now, we've got some private schools, and that's fine. But we have excellent public schools. I just saw one of my many doctors today. I asked him how his children were doing. I always do that. He told me where they all were in school, in public schools. If you don't think that's the best single thing we have to sell in North Carolina, to build this economy and get jobs in here, you are wrong. You're talking to the expert on it, I know.